On November 25th, 1177, a 16-year-old king whose body was already dying did something that should have been impossible. His name was Baldwin, a king crowned as a child and sentenced to death by disease, leprosy. His hands were rotting, his nerves were gone. Pain no longer warned him when flesh tore or bone broke. Yet that morning he rode directly toward 26,000 of the deadliest warriors on earth. By sunset, that army no longer existed. This is not a legend. This is not myth. This is history. Raw, brutal, and undeniable. 500 knights, not 5,000, not 10,000. 500. That was all he had. 500 armored men facing an ocean of steel. 26,000 mounted warriors, elite cavalry, battle-hardened veterans, men who had shattered empires and never known defeat. This was not a battle. This was a mathematical execution, a 52-to-1 disadvantage. By every rule of medieval warfare, by every military precedent ever recorded, this should have ended in minutes. A brief clash, a broken charge, a field of Christian dead. But it didn't, because the man leading those 500 was not supposed to be alive at all, a word that terrified the medieval world. It ate flesh slowly, silently, without mercy. By 16, Baldwin could no longer feel his hands, could no longer walk without agony, could no longer grip a sword without someone tying it to his wrist. His face was hidden behind a silver mask, not for ceremony but to hide what sickness had done to him. Courtiers whispered he was cursed, that God had marked him for punishment. But Baldwin understood something they did not. If his body was already lost, then fear had no power over him. Across the desert waited the opposite of Baldwin, Saladin, a man in his prime, a commander without equal, a leader whose name alone emptied castles. He had unified kingdoms, forged the most powerful Muslim army of the age, and crushed every force sent against him. His banners stretched farther than the eye could see, his cavalry moved like a living tide. And now he marched toward Jerusalem. The city was nearly defenseless. Its nobles prepared ships for exile. Its people prayed for mercy. The fall of the kingdom was no longer a question of if, only when. But Baldwin refused to wait behind walls. He refused to surrender the future to arithmetic. Carried into council on a litter, barely able to breathe through pain, he made his choice. He would ride out, not to delay the inevitable, but to break it. They marched 45 miles in 36 hours, an impossible pace. Healthy men collapsed, horses foamed and staggered. Baldwin fainted from pain and was lifted back onto his saddle. Strapped in place, unable to grip with his legs, unable to feel his hands. He still led, because this march was not about strength, it was about timing. Saladin believed Baldwin would hide, so discipline relaxed. The massive army spread wide, foraging, resting, unarmored. 26,000 warriors stretched across miles of open land, confident, careless. At noon, dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Saladin dismissed them. Baldwin would never dare. He was wrong. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, Baldwin raised his bandaged hand. 500 lances lowered. 500 horses surged forward. They charged straight into the heart of an army 50 times their size. This was not courage. This was defiance against reality itself. What Saladin did not see were the ravines beneath his feet. What looked like open ground was broken, uneven, lethal. Baldwin had seen it, and when panic struck, those ravines became traps. The first impact was catastrophic. The Templars smashed into the center, not striking and withdrawing, but driving forward, deeper, harder. Veterans froze. Commands vanished in dust and screams. Then something broke. Not steel, not formations. Belief. When Saladin fled on a camel, his army understood the truth. This battle was lost. What followed was not war. It was annihilation. Men ran, straight into death. By sunset, less than 2,000 survived. 20,000 lay dead. And the dying king collapsed from his saddle. Jerusalem had been saved, not by numbers, but by will. This was the Battle of Montgisard. The day 500 rewrote history. The day mathematics failed. The day a dying teenager broke an empire. By the age of 16, King Baldwin IV was already dying. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. Every day his body betrayed him a little more. This was the king who would soon face the greatest army of the age. Baldwin was crowned at 13, a child placed on a throne surrounded by steel, faith, and fear. But the crown did not make him powerful. It only made his suffering visible. Leprosy had already begun its slow, merciless work. It destroyed sensation first. Pain disappeared, then pressure, then control. By 16, Baldwin could no longer feel his own hands. They were wrapped in silk bandages, not to protect wounds, but to remind him where his fingers were. When he held a sword, he could not feel the grip. He could not feel the blade's weight. If the weapon slipped, he would not know until someone shouted. In the medieval world, leprosy was not just disease, it was judgment. People believed God marked the unworthy with visible decay. Courtiers whispered behind pillars. Priests avoided his shadow. Foreign rulers watched closely, waiting. They said the king was cursed, that his reign was temporary, that Jerusalem itself was doomed. Baldwin knew all of this, and he did not deny it. Because when you know you will die young, you stop pretending the future belongs to you. You stop ruling for appearances. You rule for truth. His face was hidden behind a silver mask, not for mystery, not for drama, but because disease had erased what once was there. The mask became a symbol, not of weakness, but of defiance. Behind it was a mind sharpened by urgency. Baldwin ruled with terrifying clarity. He listened carefully. He spoke little, and when he decided, he never hesitated. Every choice mattered. Every mistake would outlive him. Across the desert stood his opposite, Saladin. Where Baldwin was fragile, Saladin was unbreakable. 40 years old, battle-hardened, untouched by defeat. A man shaped by victory. He had done what no one else could. He unified Egypt and Syria, two great powers bound by rivalry, into a single force. From the Nile to the Euphrates, his authority was unquestioned. He commanded wealth without limit, armies without number, and men who believed following him was obedience to God. Castles surrendered at the sound of his name. Garrisons melted away before banners even appeared. His cavalry moved like a living organism. Disciplined, relentless, unstoppable. Saladin did not conquer through chaos. He conquered through inevitability. By 1177, the fall of Jerusalem was considered certain. Not debated, not feared, expected. Even within the city, hope was rationed. Nobles prepared ships in secret. Treaties were quietly discussed. Exile plans were written and rewritten. The kingdom's best knights were scattered across distant fortresses. Jerusalem itself was nearly defenseless. Against Saladin's power, resistance seemed irresponsible. The kingdom had weeks, maybe days, and Saladin knew it. He did not rush. He advanced like history itself. Slow, confident, unstoppable. His army was the largest he had ever gathered. This was not a raid. This was the final chapter. So when Saladin looked toward Jerusalem, he did not see a threat. He saw a dying boy, a sick king hiding behind walls, a city waiting to be claimed. What he did not see was urgency. He did not see a man who had already accepted death, and therefore had nothing left to lose. Baldwin understood something Saladin did not. Empires calculate, dying men decide. And when the moment came, when history narrowed to a single choice, the Leper King would not wait for fate to arrive. He would ride out to meet it. The invasion did not begin with chaos. It began with certainty. That autumn, Saladin gathered the greatest army of his life, 26,000 mounted warriors, an ocean of steel, leather, and faith stretching across the desert. Among them, 8,000 elite Mamluks, slave soldiers trained from childhood to kill without hesitation, to obey without question, to die without fear. This was not a raid. This was conquest. Jerusalem stood naked before it. The city's garrison numbered fewer than 1,000 men, not enough to defend the walls, not enough to man the towers, not enough to survive a siege. The arithmetic of annihilation was simple. Saladin knew it. His generals knew it. Even Jerusalem's own nobles knew it. This war was already over. Only the paperwork remained. Saladin advanced north slowly, methodically. Not because he feared resistance, but because there was no urgency. Why rush when history itself was marching beside you? His supply trains stretched for miles. His banners darkened the horizon. This army was built to endure, to besiege, to starve, to erase. As Saladin rode, he already divided the land in his mind. Which emirs would rule which cities, which fortresses would be dismantled, which churches would fall silent. Jerusalem was no longer a question, it was an appointment. Inside the city, the air was heavy with resignation. Nobles spoke in whispers. Priests prayed longer than usual. Ships waited quietly in the ports as insurance, because everyone understood the truth. When Saladin arrived, there would be no miracle. And then Baldwin made his decision. The advisors came first, veterans of diplomacy, men who had survived defeats by compromise. They begged him to flee. A dying king had no place on a battlefield. A leper king had no business leading a last stand. If Baldwin lived, the dynasty might survive elsewhere. If he died, everything died with him. Their logic was flawless. Baldwin listened and refused. He was carried into the war council on a litter, not walking, not standing, carried, because his legs no longer obeyed him. Every movement sent pain through a body that could no longer feel pain correctly. Only pressure, only tearing, only exhaustion. His breathing was shallow. His hands trembled beneath their silk wrappings. And yet when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, clear. "I may die tomorrow," he said, "or in 10 years, but I will die defending this kingdom." There was no anger in his voice, no drama, only certainty. Baldwin understood something his advisors did not. Jerusalem could survive defeat. It could not survive surrender. Walls fall, cities burn. But once a king flees, the idea of the kingdom dies forever. So Baldwin gathered everything he could. Not an army, a fragment. 500 knights, not 5,000. Not even 1,000. 500. 80 Templars among them. Men who had sworn never to retreat, never to surrender, never to compromise. 3,000 infantry followed, mostly levies, farmers, merchants, men with courage and little training. Against 26,000 professionals, this force bordered on absurd. And then Baldwin did something no one expected. He did not wait behind Jerusalem's walls. He did not pray for relief. He did not negotiate. He marched out. The gates of Jerusalem opened not for retreat, but for attack. Citizens watched in stunned silence as their king passed beneath the arches, strapped to his saddle, unable to grip with his legs, unable to feel the reins in his hands. The silver mask caught the sun, not hiding weakness, announcing defiance. This was not strategy as textbooks describe it. This was not caution. This was timing. Baldwin knew he could not win a siege. He knew he could not outlast Saladin. But he also knew this: large armies are strongest when they are patient, and weakest when they are confident. Somewhere ahead, Saladin's forces were spreading out, foraging, relaxing, certain of victory. They did not yet know they were being hunted. And Baldwin, a dying king with nothing left to preserve, was already moving. Not to survive, but to strike first. 45 miles, 36 hours. No rest, no mercy. For healthy men, it was madness. For a king whose nerves were dissolving inside his body, it was torture beyond language. Yet the march did not slow. It accelerated. This was not an army on parade. It was a race against extinction. Boots tore skin from feet. Horses staggered, foam spilling from their mouths. Men marched half awake, guided by pain and fear alone. And at the center of it all, King Baldwin, 16 years old, dying. Leprosy had robbed him of sensation. Pain no longer warned him when his body failed. He collapsed without realizing why. The Templars lifted him when he fell. They carried him like a relic, then strapped him back onto his saddle when consciousness returned. Leather cut into his legs, metal pressed against infected flesh. He could not feel it, only the weight, only the urgency. This was not a march to defend Jerusalem's walls. Walls could be breached, sieges could be waited out. Baldwin knew that. This march had one purpose: to find a moment, a fracture, a mistake. Because large armies do not fall to strength, they fall to timing. Through the night they moved. No songs, no speeches. Only the sound of breathing, hooves striking stone, and armor grinding against bone. Templars rotated positions, not to rest, but to stay awake. Because if they stopped moving, the king would die. And if the king died, the kingdom died with him. As dawn broke on November 25th, the land opened before them. And then, the scouts returned. Their faces were pale, their voices low, but their words were electric. Saladin's army was spread wide, miles wide, not in battle formation, not armored, not ready. Foraging parties dotted the countryside like ants. Horses unsaddled, weapons stacked, discipline loosened by certainty. The greatest army of the age was unguarded. They had found it, the opening. Saladin had made a single assumption, a reasonable one, a fatal one. He believed Baldwin would hide. Why wouldn't he? A dying king, a fractured kingdom, a city barely defended. Every precedent of war said the same thing. Weak rulers retreat. Sick kings survive by waiting. Walls exist for a reason. So Saladin relaxed. He allowed his army to spread out, to feed, to breathe, to enjoy victory before it arrived. This was not arrogance, it was experience. Saladin had never been punished for confidence before. At noon, dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Messengers arrived. Movement to the north. Fast. Unusual. Saladin listened, then dismissed the reports. It made no sense. Baldwin would not dare. He assumed it was a scouting force. A nuisance. Nothing more. After all, who charges 26,000 men with 500 knights? Saladin returned to planning, to dividing land, to writing history in advance. Behind him, his army remained scattered, separated by distance, by terrain, by complacency. What he did not see was the difference between a healthy king and a dying one. Healthy rulers calculate survival. Dying rulers calculate meaning. Baldwin did not care if he lived another year. He cared if Jerusalem lived another day. And now, as the sun climbed higher, his knights saw something they could hardly believe. Not an army, but an opportunity. The march ended. The hunt was over. And somewhere ahead, Saladin's greatest strength, his numbers, were about to become his weakness. In moments, the dust on the horizon would no longer be a warning. It would be a signal. 300 men disappeared, not retreated, not wounded, not captured, erased, crushed beneath hooves, impaled by shattered lances, trampled into the dust so completely that survivors would later swear they had never existed at all. This happened in seconds. And then, the impossible happened. Saladin's center did not retreat. It buckled, like a dam cracking under pressure. Veterans froze in place. Horses screamed and reared. Commands dissolved into noise. Men who had never known defeat stood motionless, their minds refusing to process reality. Because armies do not behave this way, not armies this large, not armies this confident, not armies led by Saladin. Dust swallowed the field. Screams drowned orders. Steel rang against steel, then against bone. The battlefield lost all structure, and in that chaos, something occurred that both sides recorded with disbelief. Baldwin raised his sword, a sword held by hands that should not have been able to grip anything. Hands ravaged by disease, nerves long dead, fingers wrapped in silk so he could remember where they were. Yet there he was, strapped to his saddle, bleeding, barely conscious, leading. Christian chroniclers wrote of it in awe. Muslim chroniclers wrote of it in horror. The Leper King, the dying boy, was at the front of the charge, not directing from safety, not gesturing from behind, but riding into the storm. That sight shattered something deep. Men do not expect kings to die beside them. They expect kings to survive. And when soldiers saw Baldwin, already condemned by fate, charging as if death were irrelevant, fear changed sides. The center gave way. Not slowly, not orderly. It folded inward. Units collided, horses slammed into horses, men fell and were crushed by their own allies. The pressure from behind forced more bodies forward. No room to fight, no room to breathe. At 2:45 p.m., panic spread. Not fear, panic, the kind that erases discipline and replaces thought with instinct. One unit stepped back, another turned sideways, a third broke entirely. And panic does not stay contained, it multiplies. At 3 p.m., the unthinkable happened. Saladin's personal guard broke. These were not common soldiers, they were elite Mamluks, men sworn to die before abandoning their sultan, men who had faced death their entire lives. And yet, they ran. Saladin looked at the field, at the collapsing center, at the screaming horses, at the impossible momentum of 500 men who would not stop, and he chose survival. He abandoned his horse, too slow, too visible. He mounted a camel and fled. That single image, the Sultan escaping on a pack animal, ripped the heart out of his army. If Saladin ran, what hope did anyone else have? Men threw down weapons. Armor was discarded. Discipline evaporated. They ran, straight into the ravines. What had looked like open ground became death traps. Narrow cuts in the earth filled instantly with bodies. Men tripped, fell, were trampled by those behind them. Some died from wounds. Most died from suffocation, crushed beneath the weight of their own retreat. Bodies stacked 20 feet deep. The earth itself clogged with the dead. The pursuit lasted 2 hours. 2 relentless hours of exhaustion and slaughter. Knights whose horses should have collapsed kept riding. Weapons broke. They used swords. Swords dulled. They used maces. Some used bare hands. The killing became mechanical, horrific, unstoppable. When the sun began to fall, the field fell silent. Of 26,000 warriors who had woken that morning, fewer than 2,000 survived. What remained was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard so vast that horses stepped carefully, as if the ground itself might give way. And at the center of it all, Baldwin finally collapsed. The king had won. The army had been annihilated. History had been broken. This was the moment numbers stopped mattering. The moment fear chose a side. The moment a dying teenager outgeneraled the greatest commander of his age. And the battle was still not finished. When the killing stopped, the world went silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of exhaustion. 20,000 men were dead. The battlefield was no longer ground. It was a carpet of bodies. Steel lay twisted in the dirt. Broken lances jutted from flesh. Horses stepped carefully as if the earth itself might collapse beneath the weight of death. The ravines were no longer visible. They were filled, layer upon layer, bodies stacked so deep that the dying suffocated beneath the dead. This was not victory. This was annihilation. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the impossible finally took its toll. Baldwin was lifted from his horse and collapsed. Not dramatically, not heroically. His body simply failed. The effort of leading the charge, the pain, the blood loss, the strain of hours strapped to the saddle, it had almost killed him. Almost. Before allowing himself rest, before water, before treatment, Baldwin did one final thing. He knelt. 500 knights knelt with him, men soaked in blood, some their own, most not. Men who had killed without pause for hours, men whose arms still trembled from violence. They knelt in the middle of 20,000 corpses, and they prayed, "Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory." There were no cheers, no triumphal cries, only breathing and silence. That afternoon saved Jerusalem. It shattered an army the world believed unbeatable. It broke the momentum of conquest. It bought the kingdom time, years it never should have had, and it nearly killed its king. News spread faster than belief. Across the Levant, men whispered the numbers in disbelief. 500, 26,000. No one could explain it. Christian chroniclers called it a miracle. Muslim chroniclers called it punishment. Both agreed on one thing. Something beyond calculation had occurred. Saladin survived. He escaped humiliation and slaughter on a camel. He returned to rebuild. And he did. 10 years later, Jerusalem would fall. History would continue. Empires would rise and collapse as they always do. But Saladin never forgot Montgisard. Years later, he spoke of Baldwin. Not with mockery, not with hatred, with respect. "I feared that man," he said, "more than any army." Because Baldwin understood what numbers cannot measure. Armies count men. Commanders count supplies. Empires count time. But war is not decided by arithmetic alone. Baldwin knew belief could bend reality. That men who believe death is already decided fight differently. That courage is contagious. That fear spreads faster than commands. And that sometimes, just sometimes, history hesitates. For one impossible afternoon, 500 men held back the tide of conquest. For one impossible afternoon, a dying teenager outgeneraled the greatest commander of his age. For one impossible afternoon, mathematics failed. Baldwin would not live long. His body continued to decay. By the end, he was blind, unable to walk, barely able to speak, but his mind remained sharp, and his legacy was already written. The tragedy is cruel. The kingdom he saved could not survive without him. 2 years after his death, Jerusalem fell. The tide returned. History resumed its course. But Montgisard remained, a scar on certainty, a reminder carved in blood, that sometimes, against every rule, against every calculation, one man's resolve can stop an empire. And that is why this battle endures, not because of the victory, but because it should never have happened.